All right, so as promised, here's an in-depth look at Moorish and Indian nationality and identity and why that is important to the so-called blacks of America. In honor of Joe Biden recently taking office, let's go ahead and start with this House Resolution 689. We said we would be talking about House Resolution 689. We would also be talking about the rights of indigenous peoples, Article 6 of the Constitution, and more. So let's start with this House Resolution 689. So if you type this in your Google search, House Resolution 689, and you can put out Moors beside it, Moors, and this document will come right up and you just have to scroll to the number 689. All right, so, and it reads, whereas the Moorish Americans are descendants of the ancient Moabites, Hamites, and Canaanites who were permitted by the old pharaohs of Kemet. And if you don't know what Kemet is, that's Egypt. Were permitted by the old pharaohs of Kemet to traverse from East Africa and later form themselves kingdoms extending from the northwestern and southwestern shores of Africa, the Atlantic islands, and on to the present-day continental Americas. And whereas the indigenous Moorish peoples of the Americas are now united in order to again link themselves with the family of nations. And whereas the Moorish Americans, being aboriginal to the territories of the North, Central, and South America, have formed a sovereign theocratic government guided by the command principles of love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice through the virtue of the universal right to self-determination, as well as the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People guaranteed in the Charter. And whereas on January 8, 1886, Noble Drew Ali was born in the state of North Carolina, destined to become the first patriot of his mentally enslaved Moorish American people. In 1912, he was anointed as El Hajj Sharif Abdul Ali by the leaders of Egypt and the holy city of Mecca to return to the United States as the last prophet and the founding father of the newly risen nation of Moorish Americans. As a result of the 13th Amendment, Moorish people were emancipated from slavery in 1865. Therefore, be it resolved by the House of Representatives of the 97th General Assembly of the State of Illinois that we designate this week, January 8th through the 15th, 2012, as Moorish American Week in the state of Illinois. All right, so that's the resolution in and of itself, right? And if you were just reading this without any foundational knowledge, it just seems like a lot of hoopla, for lack of better words. What is this? So the resolution established Moorish American Week in the state of Illinois in 2012, right? That's what it did. Now, why did these people take so much time to go out of their way and give such an in-depth history of these Moorish people? And if you realize in paragraph 4 here, the last sentence of paragraph 4, halfway through that sentence after the semicolon of Moorish American, as a result of the 13th Amendment, Moorish people were emancipated from slavery in 1865. So who is that group of people that was emancipated from slavery in 1865 as a result of the 13th Amendment? That would be so-called black people. All right. And what Noble Drew Ali did was establish, people tend to forget that America was not set up for cultural freedom or racial freedom, but it was set up for religious freedom. People could come here and practice any religion that they wanted to, but slavery was a product of the time and the era and the day, and this was not a place where racial or class or anything like that was the place where you could exist freely in those manners. It was specifically about religious freedom. So what Noble Drew Ali did in 1913 was create a religious organization that actually believes the facts of our ancestral lineage. So therefore it cannot be denied, because not only is it on the historical record, but it's also a religious belief, right? And so that's what his organization did, and it made sure that all of its members proclaim their nationality, which is simply to document it, and it's simply to be that, which means that you dress that way, that you actually represent the culture, which is why the fezzes are worn on Fridays, which is the holy day, right? And so as a part of the Moorish Empire, regardless as to whether you were Muslim, Christian, atheist, spiritual, there's certain codes and ethics that those who are under that nationality subscribe to. All right. So I want to touch on as well, because some people are missing the point that this is so-called Black history. All right, and so if we go back up here to the third paragraph, it talks about the Moorish Americans being aboriginal. Aboriginal meaning original to the territories of North, Central, and South America. All right, but not only that, they came from, with the permission of the pharaohs of Egypt, came from East Africa and established themselves kingdoms that extended from the northwestern and southwestern shores of Africa, the Atlantic islands, and on to present-day continental Americas, meaning they had kingdoms on both sides of the water. So yes, we're indigenous to America, north, south, and central, but we're also indigenous to Africa. It's the same bloodline on both sides of the water, and this is a political opinion representing that fact. Now, these people simply could have made the holiday without going into the history of who these people are. They simply could have said Noble Drew Ali started an organization, a religious organization, and we want to resolve that it's going to be Moorish American Week, January 8th through the 15th in 2012. But instead, under Obama's administration, under President Obama administration, and Joe Biden's as well, instead of simply leaving out the history, they chose to do an in-depth history of the Moorish Americans. So this is House Resolution 689, and this is speaking specifically to the so-called Black Americans. All right, this is Moorish, right? This is House Resolution 689. So let's go to, now I want to touch on a couple of colonial documents, right? Slave documents, because people oftentimes will say, well, you know, I see that this says that, but where is some other historical evidence? So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go straight into some of these colonial laws, okay? Some of these colonial documentations, laws, and letters from people of the time, all right? So, and we're going to go from the bottom to the top. And if we talk about what a Moor is, then it's going to tell you, the definition is going to tell you it's a Berber. The definition changed over time. So the tribal identity would be the Berber tribes, what they call the Berber tribes, all right, or the Amazigh tribes, which is a collection of many different tribes of North and West Africa, all right. It also, later as time moved on and we began to take over much of Europe with the Arabs, it became applied to the Arabs as well. And because we were practicing the religion of Islam, it became synonymous with Islam. It became synonymous with dark skin as well. So these are the different meanings of the word as it changed throughout time. But the actual tribal identity is the collection of tribes known as Berbers. All right. And so, and the actual political or national identity would be Moroccan specifically. That's what Moor means specifically. It means Moroccan when we're talking about from a national standpoint. All right. So let's go into these colonial laws. So in Georgia, there was no mention of Moors that I found. But what I did realize is that they were using in their slave laws, they did use Indian. All right. They used Indian as a talking about the people, and there were Muslim slaves in Georgia as well. So that's in Georgia. In South Carolina, there's a couple different references to the Moors in South Carolina. So there is a Negro slave law that actually mentions specifically that Negro is confined to Berber. And as we talked about before, Moor, when we're talking about ethnic stock, is specifically those Berber tribes. So in South Carolina, which was one of the major slave importing locations, they're telling you that these people are Berbers. All right. So not only that, there's the Sundry Free Moors Act of 1790 prior to this Negro law. And this just shows that Moors were actually being enslaved. But not only that, if the people could prove that they were subjects of Morocco, then they would be treated as free white people or American citizens. All right. So that's in South Carolina. And if we move along to, and I just want to point out that we're going to see this in Virginia as well, that they make the distinction between Moroccan Moors, which are in enmity with, in 1790, the United States, and prior to that, were in enmity with England, the British Crown and the British colonies. Okay, so in North Carolina, there's really not much mention of slave laws. They're typically following the law of South Carolina. All right, in Virginia, if we move on to Virginia, we see several different references where they are referencing these people as Indians, Indian slaves, Indians. All right, and we also notice the distinction between Moors, Moroccan Moors, and the protection of those Moors who are in enmity with the crown of England, and the distinction between Islamic Moors or any other type of Moors, Moors who are Moors by blood but are not specifically subjects of Morocco. We see this in Virginia. In Maryland, the language they're using in the slave laws is Negroes and other slaves. But we know in Maryland that there are Muslims there from the story of Job Suleiman, story of Yarrow. All right. In Delaware, there was a tribe. We're just going down the colonies. There was a tribe called the Lenape tribe, and this specific tribe was known as Moors. All right, they were known as Lenape. They were known, that was their actual name. What they called themselves was the Lenni Lenape tribe. They were known also as Delaware, the Delaware tribe, and they were known also as Moors. Now, the Delaware tribe consisted of they inhabited the lands of New Jersey, East Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, and Delaware. All right. So that's showing you that there were people who were known as Moors, and that Moors and Indians, Moorish Indian, there's this unity, or there's this relationship between them, which is shown through the Lenape Moors. All right. If we move on to Pennsylvania, there's a quote from Herman's Abden Graef. He was a Mennonite, which the Mennonites were actually paying taxes to the Delaware Moors during this time. But Herman's, in a quote, in a letter that he wrote, he was saying he told his quaint German how black men or Moors were sold as slaves. And notice that black men is lowercase and Moors is capitalized, showing that Moorish is the nationality of these enslaved people, while black is simply a brand that's put on the people. All right. The slave laws are typically using language of Negro or mulatto, but there's also a quote that talks about how so many Indian slaves were traded to Pennsylvania that a law was passed in 1705 forbidding the importation of the Carolina Indian. All right, so they're telling you in Carolina that these are Indian slaves, right? So we know that in Carolina they are Berber because it said the Negro was specific to Berber. And now we're finding out also that they're Indian because Pennsylvania was getting so many Indian slaves from the Carolinas that they had to make a law against it in 1705. So that's Pennsylvania. In New York, it said that New York was founded by the Dutch as New Amsterdam and was heavily populated by Sephardic Jews and Muslim Moors. All right, and that's in Jews and Muslims in British colonial America in the preference. All right, and so this is just a slew of information. In New York, they're typically using the language and the slave codes of Indian slave laws. In Connecticut, we have this reference again to this connection between the Moors and the Indians, and that is in what's called the Moorish Charity School. All right, so the Moorish Charity School was actually a school to basically colonize the Indians through education. So take them out of their original culture and educate them in a European fashion. And they called this school that was meant to educate Indians, they called it Moorish Charity School. And this was in 1704 in Connecticut. If we move on to Rhode Island, let's see, we talk about, there's not really much mention of Moors here that I found specifically, but it talks about how there were Rhode Island, along with many northeastern states, captured many Indian slaves. All right, captured many Indian slaves in Rhode Island. In Massachusetts, there was a notice to blacks and Moors, and it talks about how this is where we see again the relationship between Moroccan Moors having some form of protection during colonial times. And it talks about how the only Negroes who are protected are those who are under Moroccan protection. Otherwise, you need to get out within a certain time frame, right? So, and there's also another quote here that says, I suppose you know very well how we should maintain 20 Moors cheaper than one English servant. All right. So these are some of the colonial laws. And this is just doing a quick search. This isn't even going in depth. So 10 out of the 13 colonies mention Moors, and 7 out of the 13 mention Indian, right? And so this is our history. This is our collective history. When we talk about Negro, what is a Negro? What nationality is that? How is that defining your legacy or your bloodline? It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with the fact that you're property. And so our people are not property. And before we were known as black, we were known as Moorish, and we were known by our specific Indian tribes. And I want to touch on this quote also from the Smithsonian, because we've just read House Resolution 689 that talked about how the Moors established kingdoms on the northwestern and southwestern shores of Africa, as well as the Atlantic Islands and North, South, and Central America. We talked about that. So the Smithsonian talks about how during a very crude time that and it's so funny how they word this stuff. They don't want to simply say it, but they say, presumption, tend to presume, but that there was no lack that stopped the transition from traveling from the east to the west from a very crude time. All right, and this is the Smithsonian admitting this. Okay, and so we talked about that. Let's touch on the rights of indigenous people, right? Because House Resolution 689 says that this is something that applies to us. We have the right to self-determination, and we have the right to self-determination to represent ourselves as a people, as a nation of people, also by right of the rights of indigenous people. So I'm just going to read just a few. I'm not going to spend all day on this, but you can just simply type this in your Google search, the rights of indigenous people, and the document will come right up. But I'm not going to spend all day going through all of these, but I just want to touch on a few different sections and words here. But I just want to see where you see here under the General Assembly and going down to the second paragraph, affirming that indigenous people are equal to all other people, while recognizing the right of all peoples to be different, to consider themselves different, and to be respected as such. So that is your inherent right on this land and in any land that you inhabit, be it in Africa or be it in America, because we are indigenous to both sides. We are simply indigenous to the planet. And that's what it is, right? So there's just a couple different laws here I want to touch on. Let's see, what does this say here? Recognizing also the urgent need to respect and promote the rights of indigenous people affirmed in the treaties, agreements, and other constructive agreements with states. All right. And that's important because we need to touch on Article 6 now of the Constitution. So if we go to the Constitution of America, and we can come back to the rights of indigenous people, but if we go to the Constitution of America, let's see if I can find this Article 6. If we come to the Constitution of America, we see that in Article 6, it talks about how treaties are the supreme law of the land, and every judge shall know them and be bound to this. So now we're finding out that we are Moorish people and we are Indian people, and that we have specific treaties with these people. This is the supreme law of the land, the supreme law, not a second-class law, not a law that you can change and flip and spin around, something that can change over times when I feel like it. If we don't like it today, we can simply change the. No, this is a supreme law. So we see that Article 6 of the we see first that Joe Biden and Barack Obama's administrations have confirmed this information, that they are of the opinion that the people who were emancipated by the 13th Amendment are actually Moorish people. And not only that, but that they are Moorish indigenous people, and that the rights of indigenous people applies to these people. And based on Article 6 of the Constitution, the supreme law of the land is treaties. All right. And the only way you can be attached to a treaty is through your nationality. So back to the rights of indigenous people, right? Recognizing also the urgent need to respect and promote the rights of indigenous people affirmed in treaties, agreements, and other constructive agreements with states. All right. So this is powerful information. This is 2021. It's time for us to really take charge of this information and begin to express our culture and be ourselves and actually begin to document who we are. And when we actually fill out documents, make sure that we're putting the correct identification down, not black, not something that's going to detach us from the human family, but something that's going to attach us to our illustrious heritage of who we actually are. Okay. So these are just you can go through the rights of indigenous people and look through them on your own, right? Let's see. I just want to see, because one thing that we really have to do, here's another one that I want to point out, recognizing in particular the rights of indigenous families and communities to retain shared responsibility for the upbringing, training, education, and well-being of their children, consistent with the rights of the child, which is another document, just like the rights of indigenous people. They have the rights of the child, Universal Declaration on the Rights of the Child. All right, so this is important because it's not only enough to simply say that you're Moorish or say that you're Cherokee or Choctaw or Shawnee and apply those treaties. The real work comes in with us actually getting together and saying, okay, what kind of institutions are we going to put together so that we can educate our kids and so that they don't feel like outcasts as well. So we can educate them, bring them up around their culture, bring them up in a way that they feel comfortable wearing the adornments of our ancestors, and make sure that they know exactly who we are, right? Because this article here says, recognizing in particular the rights of indigenous families and communities to retain shared responsibility for the upbringing, training, and education and well-being of their children. All right. So that's not asking for a handout. That's you being responsible for bringing up your children. All right. So I think that was a good one to point out. Here's another one on treaties. Considering also that treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements and the relationships they represent are the basis for a strengthened partnership between indigenous people and states. All right, we have the ability to create treaties with different states simply based on our nationality, but we cannot do that boxed in the category of black. All right, because black history does not go past the point of chattel slavery. There's never been a point in history where a group of people was known as black people until chattel slavery came into existence. So you can't say the ancient black Moors or the ancient black Kemites, meaning it in a national sense. Yes, sure, their skin was dark, and yes, sure, there have been references to that dark skin, but in reference to the entire group of people being called as a national identity black, it never existed until chattel slavery. So the history of black people does not go past chattel slavery. All right. So we need to get back into our proper persona. We need to proclaim our nationality. We need to, and so how do you proclaim it, right? You simply say it out of your mouth. And you simply document it wherever you can. You simply check the proper boxes when you're filling out any type of document. If it's a health document, if it's the census document, any type of document, you need to be putting the proper classification for who you are as an individual, right? All right, let's check this out. Acknowledging that the Charter of the United Nations, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, affirm the fundamental importance of the right to self-determination of all people, by virtue of which they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. So this is a responsibility. It's not having a nationality. It's cool, right? Because it's been withheld from us for so long, but it takes work to do this. It takes accountability and responsibility, and that is something that we have to get into, right? So this is just a simple in-depth. I don't want to go too far and get you put you to sleep right now, because this is simply in-depth overview. It's not an in-depth class to go deep into what all this stuff means by definition and all this. Simply a in-depth overview. But before I finish, the last thing I want to talk about is race, because the 2020 census just came out, and most people put that they were black on those census, right? But if we go look at the definitions after everything we've seen here today, this is Barack and President Barack and President Joe Biden's administration affirming this information that we are Moorish Americans and that the rights of indigenous peoples applies to us. All right, so with that information being said, Moorish people are from North Africa. They established kingdoms on the northwestern and southwestern shores of Africa and the Atlantic islands and North, South, and Central America, right? So what part specifically are you indigenous to, right? All of it is yours, but you are not as black states, a person having origins in any black racial group of Africa, because black in and of itself is not attached to the human family, while the rest of the races are actually attached to the human family. Look at any of the other races, a person having origins in original people, but black does not have origins in original people. And if we look at the definitions here, we see that based on the law.com, anterior to the adoption of the Constitution of the United States, each state had the right to make citizens of such persons as it pleased. That Constitution does not authorize any but white persons to become citizens of the United States. But what is white? Let's look at the definition of white, right? A person having origins in any of the original people of Europe. And if you go back and look at Cheddar Man, because people think the original Europeans look like what we think of today, let's look at Cheddar Man, all right? A person having origins in original people of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. And we know that the Berber population, the so-called Berber population, comes from where? North Africa, right? And they established themselves kingdoms on the shores of northwestern, southwestern Africa, onto as well as the Atlantic islands, North, South, Central America. So you cannot have a treaty. You cannot invoke your supreme rights without a nationality. Treaties are only made by way of nationality, right? So a person being a sovereign individual does not have the right to make a treaty with the government, right? That is a completely different situation. We are not representing or talking about being sovereign individuals. We're talking about our nation. We're talking about our nationality, our group that shares culture, heritage, language, and a shared continuity of history. That's what we're talking about. All right. And so when we talk about it is very important for us to understand this information and enact this information at this particular day and time. We see what's going on around us. We see the chaos, the turmoil. We see that different people are grouping up together and holding on to what they believe is the right thing for them to do. And so during this month, I think I'm so glad that people are waking up. I'm so glad. And this is regardless as to whether you identify with the Moorish nationality, a specific Indian tribe, Hebrew, Israelite. I am so happy that our people are waking up. But here's the next step. Let's not only wake up, let's proclaim that when we go out in the public. Stop calling yourself black. Stop allowing people to call you black. Let's put some documentation down, whether you take out an article in the newspaper, whether you actually write yourself an affidavit and put it on file with the county clerk. Let's make sure that we are actually documenting who we are as a people, and we're actually speaking it out of our mouths, because that's what's going to bring us. That's the first step that's going to bring us back into the ability to have power and control of our own destinies for us and our children. All right. But that's not it. At the end of the day, we still have to work together and create institutions and different systems that promote ways to educate our children. So this is a brief overview of the history of Moorish indigenous people or Moorish Indian people. And people may wonder why I'm categorizing it that way. And it's because those people who were here prior to Moorish people getting here have their own cultural identity, and that should be respected. While some of the Moors were some of the earliest people here. At the same time, when they got here, there were already people here. So that history has to be respected, even though many Moors are indigenous in terms of it relating to the arrival of the colonists or the European. It's also being categorized that way because there's a although the cultures are separate and deserve their own special attention, there's also a period where there is a shared identity and experience from the earliest times moving into slavery and into our current situation and time. So even though there were different cultures at the earliest states, there was an amalgamation of traditional Moorish culture with traditional indigenous culture. And as time went on, because we looked similar and carried ourselves in similar ways on both sides of the water, we were both targeted as victims of the transatlantic slave trade on both sides. So that has to be understood as well when we talk about Moorish Indian or Moorish indigenous history. It all has to be respected as its own individual cultures, and then there has to be points where we respect it as an amalgamation of culture and history and what that is and what that means. So this has been a brief overview. I hope that it helped you understand and gain clarity of what our nationality and identity is and why it's important. And if you have any questions, any additional questions, comments, concerns, additions, addendums, corrections, please drop it below in the comment section or DM, whatever's best for you. Peace.